Luann Briggs had been living out of a rolling suitcase and a plastic storage bin for 3 years when the letter arrived at the farm supply store where she worked the register, because the farm supply store was the most permanent address she had, and she had learned to use it for things that required an address. She was 50 years old. She worked Tuesday through Saturday, 7 to 4, and she'd been there for 2 years and 9 months, long enough to know the regular customers by name and crop type, and long enough that the owner, a man named Dale Sperry, had stopped treating her like a temporary arrangement and started treating her like someone who had decided to stay. She was paid $14 an hour, and she lived in whatever motel room was available for under $50 a night within 15 miles of the store, which in Hardin County, Iowa, meant she had a rotation of 3 motels she moved between depending on availability, and she had her system down to where it did not feel like chaos anymore, but more like a schedule with flexibility built in. The storage bin lived in the trunk of her 2008 Buick LeSabre and contained the things she did not want in a motel room overnight: her good dishes, her mother's recipe box, the framed photograph of her children from their last Christmas together before the divorce finalized, a box of letters she had kept since she was 20. The divorce had been 3 years ago. She had not been the one to file, which she noted not with bitterness, but as a fact about how certain processes begin, and she had gone through it with the same organized attention she had applied to everything in the marriage. The paperwork filed correctly, the mediation attended without drama, the assets divided according to the agreement without supplementary argument. Her lawyer had told her she was unusually composed for a client in her situation. She had said that being composed was not the same as being fine, and he had looked at her and said that was true, and that was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in the entire process. The house in Ames had gone to the settlement, which was the correct legal outcome, and she understood that, and she had not contested it because contesting things that were correctly decided was a way of spending energy you did not have on outcomes you could not change. She had been married for 22 years. She had raised 2 children, both now grown and in their own lives in other cities, and she called them on Sundays, and they called her when they thought of it, and the relationships were intact, if not close, in the way they had been when the children were young and the house was full and she was the center of something. She did not think about the house in Ames often. She thought about it the way you think about weather that has passed. You know it happened. You know what it felt like. But it is not the current weather. The current weather was a motel room in Eldora, with a window that faced the highway and a coffee maker that worked, and the rolling suitcase open on the luggage rack and her good dishes in the trunk of the Buick. She was managing. The managing was not what she had planned for 50, but she had decided some time ago that the distance between planned and actual was not a measure of failure, but a measure of life, and she was not going to spend the second half of hers measuring that distance. The letter was from an attorney in Iowa Falls named Roger Clement, and it told her that her father's brother, Roland Briggs, had died at the age of 88 in a care facility in Iowa Falls and had left his estate to her, specifically a parcel of 22 acres in Hardin County, including a farmstead, the farmhouse having been demolished by the county 7 years prior due to structural failure, and a timber frame barn of approximately 1930s construction, currently standing but in significant disrepair, together with the land and all appurtenances thereto. Roland Briggs had never married. He had farmed the 22 acres himself until his mid-70s, then rented the land to a neighboring operation, and had moved into the care facility at 82. He had been described by Luann's father, who had not been close to him, as a private man with strong opinions about his own business, which was a description that could mean several things and in Roland's case appeared to mean all of them simultaneously. Luann had met Roland 4 times. She remembered a tall man with a habit of looking at you for a moment before he spoke, as though deciding whether what he was about to say was worth saying. She thought it was an admirable habit. She had not known he had kept track of her. She drove to Iowa Falls on her day off and met Roger Clement in his office and signed the transfer documents. The 22 acres were currently leased to a neighboring farm operation, the lease running through the following March, generating $4,800 annually in rental income that had been accumulating in an estate account and now transferred to her. She had not known about the lease income either. She drove to the property that same afternoon. The barn stood at the end of a gravel lane off County Road S56, a timber frame structure of white oak and elm, the siding boards weathered to silver gray, the gambrel roof intact, but the cedar shake worn through in two places where daylight showed. The farmhouse foundation was still there, a concrete rectangle in the weeds south of the barn. The basement open to the sky, a stand of volunteer cottonwood coming up through it. She walked the land first, the way she walked everything new, systematically, without hurrying, noting what was there and what it told her. The 22 acres were good Iowa ground, dark topsoil, the drainage tile lines visible at the field edges where the neighboring operation had maintained them. She walked the perimeter and came back to the barn and stood at the big sliding door, which moved on its track with resistance, but moved. She went in. The interior was large, 60 feet long, 30 wide, the timber frame bents rising to the peak of the gambrel. The original white oak mortise and tenon joinery still tight at every connection in a way that told her the building had been well made and had been made by someone who understood that well made was not the same as good looking. The floor was packed earth, the haymow empty, the stalls along the east wall bare. There was a smell of old hay and dry wood and something faintly resinous that she could not immediately identify. She walked the building the way she had learned to walk buildings, pressing the floor, checking the sill plates, looking at the underside of the roof, decking where the light came through the worn cedar. She had not been a carpenter or a contractor or anyone with professional building knowledge, but 22 years of owning a house in Iowa had produced a working literacy in what buildings were telling you when you paid attention. The house in Ames had been a 1940s bungalow with a drainage problem in the northwest corner of the basement, and a furnace that needed watching in February, and a roof that had needed replacing in 2017. And she had managed all of it, learned what she needed to learn to manage it correctly, and she had found that buildings rewarded attention the same way most things did, which was by showing you more of what was there. Pressing the floor, checking the sill plates, looking at the underside of the roof, decking where the light came through the worn cedar. The bones were sound. The repairs needed were real but not structural. The two sections of roof, the siding boards on the north end where moisture had gotten in and softened the lower courses, the sliding door track that needed cleaning and lubrication. She was not a carpenter, but she had managed a house for 22 years, and she knew the difference between a building that needed work and a building that was done. This one needed work. She walked to the back of the barn. There was a tack room built into the southwest corner, perhaps 12 by 14 feet. Its walls board and batten construction, a small window on the south wall, a door with a wooden latch. She went in. The tack room was empty except for a wooden saddle rack against the north wall and a shelf along the west wall that held several rusted coffee cans and a coil of baling wire. She was about to turn and leave when she noticed the east wall. The east wall of the tack room was board and batten like the others, but the boards were different. The other walls had boards that were the same weathered silver gray as the exterior siding, the wood dry and slightly cupped with age. The east wall boards were a slightly different color, still weathered, but a tone darker, as though they had come from a different tree or had been milled at a different time. And the battens, the narrow strips of wood covering the seams, were attached with cut nails on the other walls, the flat-headed variety that had been standard before the 1880s. On the east wall, the battens were attached with wire nails, the round-headed kind that had come into common use after the turn of the century. She stood and looked at the east wall for a long time. She was 50 years old, and she had spent 22 years maintaining a house. And she knew what it looked like when someone had replaced a wall section, and she knew what it looked like when someone had built a wall in front of another wall. This looked like the second thing. She went back to the Buick and got the pry bar she kept in the trunk because she was a practical woman who had learned that a pry bar was a tool you needed more often than you expected. She worked the first batten off, carefully, preserving it. The board beneath it was tight against its neighbors. She worked the pry bar into the gap and applied steady pressure. And the board came free, and behind it was not the exterior barn siding. Behind it was a cavity, roughly 8 inches deep, running the full length and height of the wall, and in the cavity, standing upright on the earth floor and leaning against the original exterior wall behind them, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now stiff brown sheeting that crumbled at the edges when she touched it, were paintings. She counted them by feel before she could see them properly, working her hand along the row of wrapped rectangles. She counted 23. She pulled one free carefully. The oilcloth wrapping had been tied with twine that had dried and hardened over the decades but had not rotted, and she worked the knots loose rather than cutting them because she was careful with things. Inside the oilcloth, a canvas, stretched on a wooden frame, the surface facing inward. She turned it over. The painting was of an Iowa field in summer, a long view across a harvested wheat field toward a tree line, the sky enormous and the light particular in the way of Iowa summer light at afternoon, the kind of light that is not beautiful in a simple way but is true in a way that takes time to understand. The painting was signed in the lower right corner, R. Briggs, 1934. She set it carefully against the saddle rack and pulled out a second. An Iowa town main street, winter, the buildings small against the flat white sky, a hardware store and a grain elevator and a barber shop, 3 people on the sidewalk bent against the cold. Everything rendered with an attention to specific detail that made the town feel not like a symbol of something but like an actual town on an actual morning. Signed, R. Briggs, 1936. She pulled a third. A farmstead at dusk, the barn the same gambrel shape as the one she was standing in. The farmhouse lights on, the sky the purple-gray of Iowa dusk in October, a man visible in silhouette at the barn door. Signed, Ishar Briggs, 1938. She sat on the floor of the tack room with 3 paintings and 20 more in the wall and the late October light coming through the south window, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a moment that does not require explanation, that Roland Briggs had been a painter, that he had been a painter who had hidden his best work inside his own barn wall, that the barn had been standing in Hardin County for 80-some years with 23 paintings inside it, and nobody had known. She found the letter at the back of the cavity, behind the last painting, in a tin tobacco box. It was from Roland, written in 1942 in a hand that was precise and unhurried, and it was addressed to whoever finds these, which she read and thought was very Roland Briggs, that instead of naming a person he had addressed the future directly. He wrote that he had been painting since he was 22, taught himself from library books and from looking at everything carefully, and that the paintings in this wall were his best work, not his early work, not his practice work, but the paintings he had made between 1931 and 1941, when he understood what he was doing well enough to do it. He had hidden them in 1942 because dealers from Des Moines and Chicago had been coming through the county buying Iowa farm art for prices that he described as an insult to the decade of work behind each canvas, and he had decided he would rather wall them up and let time do what time does to value than sell them for what they were offering in 1942. He wrote that he was a stubborn man about some things, and that this was one of them. He wrote that the work was good, and he knew it was good, and that whoever found it would be finding something real. He closed, I hope you know what you have, because it is worth knowing. Luan read the letter twice. She read it a third time because she wanted to be certain about the last line. I hope you know what you have, because it is worth knowing. And she did want to be certain about it because she thought it was addressed to her specifically, and not just to whoever, that Roland had known the kind of person this would reach and had written to that person directly. She sat on the floor of the tack room for a long time after the third reading with the letter in her lap and the paintings leaning against the saddle rack and the afternoon light moving across the floor in the way that late October, Iowa afternoon light moves, slowly, unhurried until it is gone. She thought about Roland looking at her for a moment before he spoke at a family gathering in 1997 when she was 21, deciding whether what he was about to say was worth saying. She thought she now knew what he had decided about her 27 years later. She contacted an art appraiser in Des Moines named Catherine Voss, who had spent 30 years working regional American art. Catherine drove to the barn on a Tuesday with her equipment, and she spent 5 hours with the paintings, examining each one in full daylight from the south window, recording dimensions and condition in a notebook. She was quiet while she worked. When she was done, she sat on the saddle rack and looked at Luan directly. Roland Briggs, she said, was not a name she knew from the Iowa regionalist canon, which was not surprising because the Iowa regionalist movement of the 1930s was well documented at its center. Grant Wood, John Stuart Curry, the artists who had institutional support and gallery representation, and less well documented at its edges, where painters who worked in the same tradition without the institutional backing had simply stayed local and stayed unknown. She said that what she was looking at in this barn tack room was work of genuine quality, work that demonstrated a full command of the regionalist vocabulary, the specificity of light, the dignity of ordinary subject matter, the refusal to romanticize, and that the body of 23 canvases was coherent and significant as a group. She said that the best 8 or 10 paintings in the set were, in her professional opinion, comparable to mid-tier Grant Wood works in technical accomplishment, and that she would stake her reputation on that comparison. She said the market for discovered regional American art of this period was active and growing, particularly in the Midwest institutional market, where universities, regional museums, and historical societies had been acquiring regionalist work aggressively for the past decade. She gave Luan a range per painting and a total range for the collection, then set down her notebook and looked at Luan with the expression of someone who wanted to say something that was not in the professional report. She said that in 30 years of appraising regional American art, she had encountered perhaps 4 discoveries she would describe as significant. Work that genuinely expanded the known record of a movement, and that what was in this tack room was one of them. She said that Roland Briggs's decision to wall up the paintings rather than sell them at Depression prices was, from an art historical perspective, an act of self-belief of a kind that was rare and somewhat heroic, and that the paintings had survived in better condition sealed in that wall than they would have survived in most private collections of the same era. She said he was right about the work. That is the thing. He was right. The range per painting was between $35,000 and $90,000, weighted for quality within the set. The total range for 23 paintings was $800,000 to $1.2 million, with the higher end requiring either a major institutional sale or a combination of auction and private placement. She said the story, the sealed wall, the letter, the self-taught farmer painter who had refused Depression-era prices and walled up a decade of his best work, would itself drive interest, because the art market understood narrative. And this was a good one. She said Luan should not rush. She said Luan should let her make 3 calls to people she knew before making any decisions. Luan said she would let her make 3 calls. The land was assessed by a Hardin County agricultural real estate firm at $380,000 for the 22 acres, consistent with current Iowa cropland values and supported by the active lease and the tile drainage record. Luan sold 11 of the paintings through a combination of a regional auction at Swan Galleries in New York and 2 direct sales to Iowa institutional buyers, the University of Iowa Museum of Art and the Figge Art Museum in Davenport. Total from the 11, $640,000. She donated 1 painting, The Farmstead at Dusk, The Gambrel Barn, The Man in the Doorway, to the State Historical Society of Iowa, because she thought Roland would have wanted at least one of them to be somewhere anyone could see it, and because the man in the doorway of the barn in the painting was Roland. She was certain of it, and she thought it was correct that Roland should be in a public building where the light could reach him. The Historical Society sent a curator named Patricia Hearn to collect it, and Patricia Hearn stood in the tack room looking at the painting for a long time before she said anything. And what she said was, "This is a very good painting." Luan said she knew. Patricia Hearn said Roland Briggs would be in the catalog now, and that once he was in the catalog, he would stay there, and Luan said she was glad. The Gambrel Barn, The Man in the Doorway, to the State Historical Society of Iowa, because she thought Roland would have wanted at least one of them to be somewhere anyone could see it, and because she thought the donation was the right thing, and she had always found the right thing was not usually the hardest thing if you were willing to look at it directly. She kept 11. She kept the barn. She had a contractor assess the roof and the siding and the door track, and she paid for the repairs in the first month. She met him at the barn on a Tuesday morning and walked him through it systematically, showing him the 2 roof sections and the north siding and the door track, and he worked through the building with his own particular literacy, pressing things and looking at angles the way she had the first day. And when he was done, he told her the barn was sounder than it looked, which was the thing she had already concluded, and she told him she already knew that and asked him what the number was. The number was manageable. She paid half up front and half on completion because that was how she had always handled contractors, and she had found it produced the right incentive structure on both ends. The tack room she left alone, the east wall open, the oilcloth wrappers on the floor where she had set them. She drove to Iowa Falls and paid 2 months in advance on a rental house on River Street with a room she designated immediately as a studio, because she had decided that if Roland had taught himself to paint from library books and looking carefully, she could learn something too, and that 50 was not a starting over age. It was a starting age, which was different. She went back to the barn on a Saturday in November, the last Saturday before the lease turned over and the neighboring operation gave the keys back and the land became hers to decide about. She stood in the big open interior in the particular autumn light that came through the gambrel vents, the white oak bents above her, the packed earth floor, the smell of old hay and dry wood and the faint resin she had never identified. She thought about Roland, standing at this same spot for 50 years, farming in the day and painting on the walls of the tack room in the evening, walling up his best decade in 1942 because he refused to be paid depression prices for 10 years of genuine work, never telling anyone, farming until his mid-70s, moving to the care facility at 82, dying at 88 with 23 paintings still in the wall. She thought he had been right to be stubborn about it. She thought some things were worth the patience they required. She thought she was glad it had been her who found them, and she thought Roland had known it would be someone like her, which was why he had given the barn to her specifically, and not to anyone else. She drove back to Iowa Falls and let herself into the rental house on River Street and stood in the front room for a moment before she did anything else, because she had a habit of standing in new spaces before she populated them with her own presence, letting the room be what it was before she changed it. The room was plain. Plaster walls, oak floors, west-facing window, and it had the particular empty quality of a space that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. She thought she understood that quality. She thought she had some of it herself. She drove back to Iowa Falls and let herself into the rental house on River Street and went to the room she had designated as a studio and stood in it for a while in the late afternoon light coming through the west window. The light, the same particular Iowa light she had seen in the paintings, honest and specific and not simple, and she thought that was a good kind of light to start in.